They were never meant to be remembered. Their names, scratched into wood, whispered in hallways, swallowed by water, were erased before the ink had dried. 13 boys, taken in by a priest who promised salvation. But the walls of Blackwater Mill remember what the papers refused to print. There was no school, no adoption, no God. Only one came out breathing, and no one asked what he'd seen, because the town already knew. Massachusetts, 1895. A region shrouded in fog, heavy with religious pride and industrial sin. Behind the shuttered windows and whitewashed churches, a different scripture was written, one older than Christ, buried deeper than the graves they never marked. Blackwater Mill stood at the edge of the marshes, 4 miles from town, choked in silence, with no clear road in. Locals called it God's filter. Children entered, and the impure never returned. Father Alaric Dunn had a reputation carved from scripture and steel. He preached not to crowds, but to men behind locked doors. He spoke of a higher order, of cleansing the soul through obedience. And when the orphaned boys were sent to him, unclaimed, unnamed, forgotten, no one questioned what he did to make them pure. But purity has a cost. You don't hear this story in churches. You don't find it in textbooks. And if you try to ask anyone from the old Blackwater parish about the priesthood experiment, their faces go pale, their voices silent. Because what happened inside that mill wasn't human. The survivor was found walking barefoot through the snow at dawn. No coat, no injuries, just 13 names carved into his chest with a communion blade, and a smile like he'd seen the face of something larger than God. He never spoke again. And the townspeople? They buried what they knew, burned the records, dismantled the mill stone by stone. But the foundations remain, beneath mud, beneath guilt, beneath me, Maury. You were never meant to hear this, but here you are. And that means something. Because once you start looking into the priesthood experiment, you don't come back the same. You stop praying to light. You start listening to silence. And silence always answers. There was a time when the Blackwater region had no churches. Only stones arranged in circles, altars made of bone and moss, and rituals held not to worship, but to bind. The people here knew the land was alive, not in the poetic sense, but in the blood sense. They built their homes around it, not over it. But in 1841, when the Church of St. Odrin was chartered by the Boston Synod, something shifted. A single man had convinced the council that Blackwater held potential, spiritual soil left untended by modern theology. That man was Father Alaric Dunn. He didn't dress like the others. No golden threads, no performative collar, just wool, black, mud-stained, and eyes that never blinked when spoken to. He said the land was thirsty, and that ritual could return it to holiness. At first, the church resisted, but Dunn brought them something they couldn't ignore. Results. Tithes tripled, new believers migrated, and by 1854, St. Odrin's name was carved in stone above a slate door at the base of Blackwater Hill, far from the main road, hidden by fog, but always open. But no one knew about the mill. It wasn't on any map. It wasn't part of church property. And yet, it was funded by Boston diocesan accounts. Old ledgers show curious line items: sacrament accommodation, clerical silence provision, and once, just once, null baptism chamber, 13. What does that mean? Ask a theologian, and they'll change the subject. Ask a priest, and they'll ask if you're mocking the faith. But if you trace the documents back, before they were redacted, you'll find that the funding came not from the church alone. It came from a council beneath the church, a body that signs only in code. And one name appears again and again: Lux Sanguinis, the light of blood. It's not a congregation, it's not a denomination, it's a structure, a gatekeeper order. ancient, pre-Vatican, pre-Christian, and it exists solely to separate appearance from reality. Father Dunn wasn't a priest. He was a keeper. And the boys weren't students. They were vessels. Innocents, yes, but not in the way we understand it. They were not there to learn scripture. They were there to carry it through flesh. Do you understand what that means? Because once you do, you're in. There's no climbing back out. The boys were not chosen at random. They were found. Every one of them came from institutions that no longer exist. Fire-damaged orphanages, shuttered poorhouses, and private homes where tragedy had removed every trace of lineage. No next of kin. No records beyond a single name. And even those names felt like placeholders. There were 13. But not all arrived at once. They came in twos, sometimes threes, delivered at night, always by different hands. Monks, traveling nuns, one time even a physician, but never from the same place twice, as if someone was drawing from a larger pool, cleansing the paper trail before the ritual began. Each boy was described in records the same way: compliant, observant, unclaimed, no verbal resistance, not mute, just trained not to speak unless asked. Even when medical officials later tried to interview the surviving child, he didn't scream, didn't cry. He looked straight through the examiner, like he was waiting for something deeper than words, something older. The files were eventually locked away in the Worcester Diocese archive, along with a map showing the mill's layout, marked with unfamiliar Latin phrases, words that don't appear in any Catholic catechism. Verbum vitrium, the glass word; corpus caecus, the blind body; Ascensio 13, ascension of the 13. If this sounds like ceremony, it's because it was, but not one for public display. This was not baptism. This was replacement. The Church doesn't speak of this, but old Roman texts suggest that early clergy believed in memory vessels, children conditioned to hold a copy of sacred knowledge without understanding it, a human vault, a breathing archive. Why? Because documents can be burned, ink can be forged, but suffering remembers. And these boys, these 13, were conditioned to become that memory. No ink, no voice, just pain. Why 13? Because 12 apostles followed Christ. And the 13th was always meant for something else. He wouldn't follow. He would remain. As a bridge, one side to the past, one side to what comes next. And if you feel something stirring in your gut right now, it's not fear, it's recognition. Something inside you knows this story is real, even if your mind fights it. The Blackwater Mill was never a place of industry. No grinding, no grain, no shipments. The wheel turned, yes, but the current didn't power machines. It powered rooms, sealed compartments within the structure, hidden behind false walls, accessible only through keys long since melted down for security purposes. The outside world was meant to believe it was a workhouse, a charity-funded orphanage for boys displaced by cholera outbreaks. But inside, it was something closer to a stage. Each room held a function, not a purpose. The entrance chamber was silent, not a single chair, just salt across the floor and 7 small iron bells suspended from the ceiling. They never rang. They were there to listen. Beyond that, the corridor of reflections, a long, narrow hallway lined with mirrors, not facing outward, but angled inward, toward each other. No matter where the boys stood, they couldn't see themselves, only fragmented shapes, incomplete, looping endlessly. Psychologists today call that identity erasure. But back then, it was called clearing the host. Then came the stone room, colder, lower, beneath the mill's foundation. No light but the opening in the ceiling where rainwater dripped in rhythmic intervals, 7 drops per minute, always 7. There they would kneel, not to pray, to empty. The boys were made to fast for 21 hours. During that time, no sound was permitted, not even breath. If a child exhaled too loudly, the ritual restarted from the beginning. Some didn't make it. Some collapsed before they even reached the center. Those who did were called echoes, not by the priests, by the walls. Because the stone, soaked in a century of moss and memory, began to speak back, not in words, in vibration, a low thrum that seemed to enter the spine, twist behind the lungs, and settle beneath the ribs. Survivors of similar experiments in other parts of the country, yes, there were others, report the same phrase. It knew me before I was born. Was it the building? Was it the church? Or was it something much older, wearing the shape of both? You can still hear the sound if you stand by the remains of the mill after midnight. A hollow knock every 7 seconds, calling, not for help, but for return. It began with the clocks. There were no clocks inside the mill, only the light schedule, a pulsing oil lamp that flickered from behind a veiled slit in the ceiling. It mimicked the sun, but out of rhythm. 6 hours on, 8 hours off, then 3, then 9, then none at all. Days blurred, nights bled. And in that fog of hours, the boys began to change. They no longer asked when they would eat. They stopped asking where the others had gone. One boy, Emery, began walking in circles in his sleep. 13 steps forward, 13 steps back. His feet would bleed, but he never broke the pattern. Another, called Simon, removed the threads from his pillow one by one and placed them in his mouth, forming strange shapes on his tongue, triangles, then stars, then something no one could name. And the priests watched, never intervening, never punishing, because this was the point. They were breaking linear thought, breaking the grid that held together logic, memory, and time. Once it broke, once the mind became pliable, they began the recitations. But not in English. Not Latin either. It was older, a reconstructed language pulled from pre-Christian tablets found beneath a monastery in Carpathia. A language without nouns, only movement, sound, breath. The boys spoke it for hours, not understanding, only repeating over and over and over. And when one boy collapsed, the others stepped over him. That's what they had been taught. Compassion interrupted continuity. Continuity was sacred. One priest, Brother Matthias, wrote a journal. Only fragments remain. One line survives on a torn page. Day 27. The boys do not see us anymore. They look through us, as if we are the dream, and they are the ones waking up. Waking into what? That was never made clear. But then again, the point wasn't clarity. The point was obedience, without incentive, memory, without his, Tory, pain, without protest. And when those three conditions were met, the bell rang. The real bell, from deep within the foundation. Only once. And the boys were led to the chapel room. No crosses, no altar, only mirrors. And the 13th chair was missing, because it wasn't meant to be sat in. It was meant to be entered. The chapel room wasn't built, it was measured. Every inch, every line, every curve, calculated according to rules found not in scripture, but in a manuscript called the Codex Reversal, dated 1631, discovered in a flooded abbey near Lyon. Its measurements formed no sacred cross, but they did form something unfolded. A geometry that didn't belong to this plane. Inside, there were 12 chairs, all made from blackened oak, all identical, all facing inward toward the center. Where the 13th should have been There was only a depression in the floor, filled with ash. No one knew what burned there, or what was still burning. Because it was always warm. Always. The boys were brought in blindfolded, led one at a time by priests who never spoke. Their mouths were bound shut, a vow of silence deeper than ritual, protection from the words being said in that room. The children spoke the phrases. They did not understand them. But the room did. And when they did it right, the ash moved. Not like smoke, not like wind. It moved with decision. That's what the journals say. That's what the drawings show. The ash would rise, not scatter, but take shape, form spirals in the air, like it was reading the voices, like it was listening. And on the seventh night, the ash would fall, and the boy in the center would vanish. Not die, not scream, just disappear. No blood, no bones, no signs of struggle. Only the chair he never sat in, now warm to the touch. Of the original 27 boys, 11 vanished this way. The priests called it passing through. Through what? They never said. But Brother Matthias hinted once. There are places beneath the world, shaped not by God or devil, but by echoes of decisions never made. He believed these children, emptied of self, filled with the sacred frequency, were vessels, translators, open doors. But then he, by the end, refused to step inside the chapel room. Because something else had begun sitting in the empty 13th chair, and it began to hum. A melody without notes. A song from before sound. Not every boy passed through. Some resisted, not openly, not with defiance. That had been trained out of them long ago. But some boys, despite the rituals, despite the language, held on to something. A fragment, a memory, a name whispered in sleep. And that was enough to disqualify them. But disqualification wasn't mercy, it was punishment. Those who resisted were marked, not with ink, not with scars, but with sound. The priests would lead them into a different room, deeper inside the mill, called the Vault of Speech. There are no photos. Only one drawing remains, done by a former janitor who was dismissed for seeing what wasn't meant to be seen. He drew a door, made of ribs, not human ones. The janitor wrote, "I don't remember walking there, only the feeling of something pushing behind my eyes, like I was remembering someone else's dream." Inside that room, sound was weaponized. A single tone, pitched precisely, sustained endlessly, was played into the skulls of the resistant. The tone could not be blocked. It wasn't loud. It was internal. Like thought, but reversed. One boy, Abram, began bleeding from his eyes after 13 minutes. Another, Luke, tried to claw out his ears, but his fingernails had been trimmed short days earlier. The priests had prepared for this, but the worst were those who survived the vault. They weren't boys anymore. They were silent. Not quiet. Silent. No reaction to heat, or hunger, or pain. They moved only when told. They blinked only when watched. One priest called them blanks, but Brother Matthias wrote something else. He said they were overwritten, still human-shaped, but carrying something that wasn't them. And when he tried to baptize one of them, a symbolic gesture of returning the soul to light, the boy vomited ash, thick, coarse, warm. It matched the material in the 13th circle. That's when the priests stopped using the vault. Because the failure wasn't death. It was occupation. And one by one, the blanks were placed in the chapel. Not in the chairs, but in the walls. Their bodies fit too perfectly. Like the mill had been waiting for them. He never gave his real name. Only a single word. Vessel. They found him 26 years later, in a roadside monastery far from Massachusetts, with no records, no birth certificate, and no past. But he remembered. Not the days, not the meals, not even the rituals. Just one thing: the sound. He said it wasn't heard, it was received. Like something ancient calling through bone. A voice not shaped for human throats. And every time he closed his eyes, he saw the 13th chair. Not the one in the center of the chapel. A different one. Black, tall, wrong in dimension. Placed in a room that didn't exist when the children arrived. A room that only appeared to him once. He didn't walk there. He awoke already inside. And across from him, in the twin chair, sat a girl, wearing robes not given by the priests, speaking a language he didn't know, but understood perfectly. She didn't blink, didn't move, but every word she said arrived inside him, not in his ears, but in his blood. And she said, "You are the single page that was never written. The mill will come for you." He woke in the mill's kitchen, curled beneath the cold stove, ashes caked into his lips. No one had noticed he was gone. No one mentioned the room. But after that, he never participated in ritual again. And strangely, the priests let him be. He served food, cleaned floors, swept hallways, always watched, never touched, until the fire. In 1896, a blaze tore through the eastern wing of Blackwater Mill. The cause was unknown. Investigators later described the flames as vertical, burning not sideways but straight up, like a rope pulled tight into the sky. 13 boys died that night. The rest were never found. But the vessel, he walked free, naked, covered in soot, carrying nothing except a single black stone with impossible angles. He said nothing for 26,000 years, until a monk asked him why he kept the stone, and the vessel replied, "Because it's not a stone, it's a promise." And that night, he buried it behind the chapel. But when they tried to dig it up later, there was no chapel anymore, just soil, warm and breathing. They tried to seal it. Not just the grounds, the memory. After the fire, the property was sold to a coal syndicate under a shell name no one could trace. Official records claimed the fire was accidental, caused by a collapsed lantern, a child's mistake. But there was one problem. There was no lantern, not in the rubble, not in any inventory records. And the survivor, the vessel, never recalled light. He only remembered heat. Not the kind that scorches flesh, the kind that moves like thought. For years, the land lay dormant. No buyers, no development. Animals avoided it. Even birds refused to nest in the nearby trees. Locals said it was the soil, that it was poisoned from the fire. But they couldn't explain why no insects ever returned. Not a single ant, not a single worm, just silence. And then, the sounds came back. 22 years later, in 1918, an Army nurse assigned to a veterans asylum near the Blackwater property reported hearing chanting. Not from the patients, from the woods. It happened precisely at midnight. She said, it wasn't music. It was more like echoes imitating music. Voices moving backwards, weaving into each other, but always forming a shape. Not a melody, a structure. When she tried to draw what she heard, the result wasn't notes. It was architecture. Lines and arches, like a floor plan for something subterranean. The hospital dismissed her, called it shell shock. She was relocated to Baltimore, but her sketches were saved, tucked inside the back of her hymn book. And decades later, A geologist surveying the Blackwater plot uncovered the same exact floor plan, but underground. The shape wasn't human-made. There were no bricks, no beams, no signs of construction, just tunnels, smooth, spiraled, organic, like something had burrowed up. But there was no entrance, just 13 sealed cavities, exactly mirroring the layout of the chapel's original pews. No artifacts, no bones. But the walls were warm, and one cavity, the one closest to the center, pulsed when touched. They closed the dig, called it unstable. But one worker didn't stop. He returned at night, and the next morning, they found his boots, still standing upright, but no man inside, only ash. And beneath the ash, a black stone. They called it an isolated incident, but it wasn't. In the years that followed, more fires appeared, always in abandoned religious sites, always involving lost children, and always leaving behind the same three anomalies. No cause, no remains, and no record of ever existing, except in whispers. 901, a convent in upstate New York, burned to the foundation. Reports claimed there were 6 girls, but no enrollment records were ever produced. Just an anonymous note mailed to a local paper. They were not sisters, they were mirrors, and the mirror cracked. Counter 13, a boys' orphanage outside Pittsburgh, closed after a sudden flu outbreak. Yet no medical examiner could identify the pathogen. But one child who survived said this: "It wasn't a sickness. They were building something inside us. A voice." And in 1924, just miles from the ruins of Blackwater, a new seminary began construction. This time, under federal funding. No religious name, just a number, Facility 18. It was branded as a school for reform. But no local children were admitted. All 49 were transferred in from other states. No families listed. No files released. But one janitor, who worked there only 6 months, came forward before his death in 1953. He claimed the children weren't educated. They were observed. Each dorm had one-way mirrors. Each room played the same recording every night. The chapel remains. The chair is empty. Make yourself worthy. And the boy in room 12? He never spoke. He just scratched one word into the wood floor, over and over again. Vessel. And the night before the janitor quit, he saw something impossible. He entered the hallway at 3:13 a.m. Every door was open, and every child was kneeling, in perfect silence, facing the exact same direction, toward a blank, unlit wall, as if something stood behind it, waiting. That morning, he left and never returned. 2 months later, Facility 18 burned to the ground. Fire marshals called it a gas leak, but no gas lines were ever installed. And what they found in the ashes shocked even the most hardened officials. 13 black stones, identical in shape, each one carved with a symbol not from any known language, yet somehow unmistakably familiar. Like something we all knew once, before we were taught to forget. He was 12 when they found him, the only one, naked, burned, eyes wide open. But what disturbed the rescuers most was that he wasn't screaming. He was humming. A sound no one could trace, not a tune, not a language, just resonance, as if his body had become a chamber. The doctors called it trauma, said he was in shock. But when they tried to speak to him, something odd happened. Their voices echoed back, distorted. One nurse refused to return to the room. She claimed her own words came back wrong, not misheard, but reformed. She said it felt like her sentence had been chewed, swallowed, and whispered back in a different tone. The boy, meanwhile, was unresponsive. He didn't eat, didn't sleep. But somehow, he remained alive. His skin, though burned, never blistered. It darkened like parchment. And when they finally washed the soot from his arms, they discovered something beneath the skin. Not scars, not burns, marks. Thin, branching lines, like veins, but ink dark, spiraling across his limbs in symmetrical patterns. One pattern resembled the chapel's floor plan. Another, the tunnel map found years later. The doctors wrote it off as delusion, but the surgeon assigned to examine the boy's condition quit the profession after just one session. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "This child was written into, like a book, but the author is something we don't have words for." The boy was moved to a private institution, funded anonymously. He never spoke until his 14th birthday. That night, the staff reported a loud crash. The boy had broken his mirror, and written in his own blood on the wall was a phrase no one could explain. "I was not the last." Security footage that night was lost. All lights in the facility failed for exactly 3 minutes and 33 seconds. When they restored power, the boy was gone. No broken windows. No doors opened, only a black stone left in his bed, smooth, warm, and vibrating, not randomly, but rhythmically, as if still humming, still echoing, still calling something back. They weren't supposed to find the journal. It was buried beneath the floorboards of a condemned house outside Lowell, Massachusetts, discovered only because the demolition crew's equipment failed. Inside, beneath rotted beams and broken glass, they found a sealed tin box. And inside that, pages. Stained, warped, written in a hand that grew shakier with each entry. It belonged to Dr. Isaac Rames, the federal physician tasked with reviewing the Blackwater Orphan case in 1895. He was sent to verify the survivor's identity. What he saw instead drove him to silence. His first entry was clinical, detached, professional. Subject's eyes show no trauma response. Pupil dilation is unnatural. Vocal cords intact, yet unused. Skin bears symmetrical markings resembling ritual etching. But by the 4th page, his tone shifts. "I can't explain what I'm seeing. These are not scars. They're script. No ink, no raised tissue. As if memory itself was etched under the skin." Then the entries grow erratic. He begins reporting sounds during examinations, knocking patterns, low tones, humming, coming not from the boy, but from the room itself. He writes of sudden migraines, nausea, and the sensation that he was being observed, not by a person, but by a presence that waited behind sound. One entry, undated, is smeared and nearly illegible, but the fragments are chilling. His mouth opened, no voice, only the smell of burnt cedar and salt. "My own name," whispered from behind my teeth. It wasn't my voice. He stops writing for 11 days. When he returns, the handwriting is rushed, desperate. "They took the recordings. They sealed the files. The stone hums when I sleep. I found one under my pillow last night. I didn't put it there." The final entry is written in red pencil. He's not a survivor. He's an archive. And the others? They're not gone. They're waiting for someone to open the next room. Dr. Rames was never seen again. His house was found abandoned, clocks all frozen at 3:33. The only thing missing from his belongings? The black stone. What no one could explain was that the humming didn't stop when the box was opened. It intensified. And the demolition crew? They refused to finish the job. Every machine failed, and in the fresh cement poured over the ruins, a shape emerged days later. Circular, etched with 13 lines, all pointing toward the center. Where someone had written, crudely, "Room 13 still breathes." It started as a rumor. Old builders, disgruntled staff, whispers passed down through broken lineage caretakers. A 13th room, sealed long before the fire. But the official blueprints of Blackwater Mill list only 12 rooms, 12 beds, 12 children. That's what the report said. But the floorboards told another story. Decades after the tragedy, a historical archivist named Eli Vaughn began collecting what he called spatial memories, the lingering traces of architectural patterns too stubborn to fade. He didn't trust maps. He trusted shadows, temperature shifts, and the eerie echo of footsteps where walls no longer existed. In 1949, Eli made his way to the overgrown ruins of Blackwater Mill, armed with tools no architect would ever carry: pendulums, resonance coils, and a handmade frequency fork. And within days, he was convinced. The structure wasn't gone. Not all of it. The outer chapel had collapsed. The library, ashes. The dormitories reduced to vine-choked beams. But beneath it all, something remained. The vibrations in one corner of the foundation were stronger than anywhere else on the site. Vaughn documented his findings meticulously. The land hums like breath. The stones shift when I turn away. I placed chalk markings. They vanish by morning. He began sketching what he called echo lines, mapping out the dimensions not of what was visible, but what was implied. And at the center, a 13th chamber, circular, no doors, just walls that held air, like lungs. The locals warned him not to dig, said strange things happened to anyone who disturbed that ground. But Vaughn didn't listen. He returned one final night and never came home. When authorities searched the site, they found his equipment melted, his journal burned around the edges, and in the center of his final page, one sentence survived. It was not a room, it was a mouth. The soil around that area was tested. Elevated traces of copper, ash, and something else, human calcium, from 13 separate bodies. The official records were quietly closed again. Blackwater Mill was declared structurally unstable. But some say if you walk the path near the old creek on moonless nights, you can hear it. A breath, not of air, but of memory, of something, still waiting to be fed. He hadn't spoken in 379 days. Not a cry, not a murmur, not even the accidental sound of breath shaped into syllables. They tried everything: isolation, immersion, even pain stimuli. Nothing. Then, one night, with no provocation, the boy stood up from his cot. He walked to the corner of the observation room, the one with the sealed glass and triple-thick walls, and without looking at anyone, he whispered. The guards reported it first, a single phrase, not directed at them, not shouted, just spoken, into the air. The 13th did not burn. They didn't understand. They thought it was nonsense, the product of trauma. But when investigators reviewed the audio, they discovered something else. His words had been spoken twice, once aloud, and once beneath it, layered in a frequency too low for the human ear. A second voice, perfectly in sync, but older, deeper, not his. When sound engineers isolated the signal, they noticed irregularities in the waveform, jagged bursts, throbs of noise that looked more like heartbeat patterns than speech. And underneath it all, another phrase. I remember the shape of fire. The doctors grew nervous. How could he know what wasn't in the reports? No one told him there had been a 13th room, the fire, the circular design. But he did know. And in his second spoken sentence, the boy made it clear. They walked in, not to escape, but to stay. That's when one nurse resigned. Said she saw his shadow moving before he did. Said he didn't blink, didn't breathe. But something behind him did. And in the days that followed, the boy began rearranging objects in his room. Paper scraps, pieces of cloth, wax fragments from his untouched candles. By the end of the week, he had built a perfect replica of the Blackwater Mill. Right down to the 13th chamber, circular, unlit, facing east. The doctors thought it was a sign of progress, but the orderlies noticed something else. Each morning, the replica changed. The number of figures inside the 13th room grew by 1, until the final morning, when there were 12. And none of them looked like children anymore. Long before Blackwater Mill was built, a small theological seminary operated near the outskirts of Salem, miles inland from the sea where the woods grow thick with rot and the fog has no season. Its name was erased from church documents in 1812, but fragments remain, buried in letters, parish records, excommunications. It was called St. Crucian's Seminary of the Unbroken Tongue. No one speaks of it now, not even in whispers. The priests there studied a form of liturgy not sanctioned by Rome. They believed words were keys, that syllables, spoken in specific rhythms, could unlock the hidden blueprints of God's architecture. They weren't trying to find heaven. They were trying to unseal something buried beneath it. In one surviving record, a transcript smuggled by a dissident novice, a phrase appears 13 times. To raise the unseen altar, a child must first forget their name. That seminary vanished after a fire. Same as Blackwater. But rumors say the fire wasn't destruction. It was completion. Because months before it burned, shipments were sent from Salem to rural Massachusetts. Candles made from tallow and something else. Cloth stitched with strange geometric threadwork. And finally, the transfer of 12 orphan boys and girls. No surnames, no baptismal records, just initials, carefully erased. The trail ends there, except for one page, stored in the Vatican's restricted collection until it was stolen in 1923. That page resurfaced in a private estate sale in 1978. It shows a symbol, circular, 12 figures facing inward, and one mark in the center, not a child, but something else. A glyph older than Latin, etched in red. The page was titled simply, 13th, the mouth by which God returns. The buyer of that estate died a week later. House burned to ash. Only one object survived, a melted candle in the shape of a sea, hilled, half face, no eyes. The church disavowed the entire history, called it superstition, fabrication, heresy. But in a confidential letter leaked in 1994, a cardinal wrote, "The fire was never meant to silence evil. It was meant to hide the liturgy itself." And now, the mouth begins to remember. They said no images survived the fire, but one did. A single, sepia-toned photograph, warped at the edges, marked with chemical burns, and found in the ruins decades later by a local surveyor. It shows a hallway, long, narrow, lined with iron doors and heavy stone. At the end of the hall stands a group of children, 11 visible, all facing the camera, all expressionless, except for one detail. None of them have shadows. For years, skeptics dismissed it, a trick of lighting, an exposure error. Until 2006, when the photo was scanned into high resolution, the technician noticed something. In the center of the group, directly in front of the iron door labeled 13, the 12th child appears in the scan, but not in the original film. Only visible, digitally, barely perceptible at first, a faint outline. But as the scan deepened, layer by layer, a figure took shape. The child was not standing still. He was moving, walking toward the camera. In each scan frame, his position changed by millimeters, as if the image had captured not a single moment, but an entire approach. Even worse, when the technician enhanced the final layer. The child's face was inches from the lens, mouth open, eyes entirely white. The original photo was re-examined under UV light, and that's when they found the markings, invisible to the naked eye. Runes etched around the border, not handwritten, but burned into the gelatin. Translated, they read, "Let those who look remember." Forensic analysts ran spectral tests. The film stock used in the image discontinued in 1889. The fire at Blackwater happened in 1895, meaning the photo was taken before the orphanage was ever officially opened. And yet, every child in that hallway matches the official registry from the year of the fire, all except the 12th. He has no file, no name, just a notation found late or in a Vatican index card. Subject 20. Witness, channel, unbaptized mouth. The photo now sits in a locked vault at an undisclosed location, but copies circulate online, each one slightly degraded, each one showing more of the hallway. And some say if you look too long, the 12th child starts moving again. And this time, he isn't stopping. Her name was never published. Just initials, EW. She surfaced in 1959 in a psychiatric ward outside Detroit. 87 years old, frail, mostly nonverbal. But when a nurse played the sound of church bells one evening, something shifted. She spoke, clearly. And what she said was recorded by a young psychiatrist who had no idea what he was hearing. EW claimed she was the 13th child assigned to Blackwater Mill. But her name was not on the official ledger. Because, she said, she was never supposed to be part of the ritual. She arrived by accident. A clerical mix-up, or maybe divine interference. She remembered the others, how they stood in rows, never spoke unless instructed, how their food had no taste, no color, how the nuns would watch from behind glass panels, always writing, always listening. But what she remembered most was the song. Not music, not melody, just a hum that filled the entire building, especially at night. It came from the chapel floor, vibrating, low, constant. And as the days went on, the children began humming it back. Without being taught, EW didn't. She said her ears bled when she tried. So they took her to the subfloor, where the others never went. And there, in a room lit only by wax and bone, she saw it. A table of stone, with grooves shaped for bodies, 12 small grooves, and one larger in the center. Empty. The priests called it the listening table. They said it was waiting for someone who had not been named by God, someone who could speak backward, in a tongue that unmade scripture. They tried to make her lie on it. But something happened. She doesn't know what. One moment she was there. The next, she was on a road, covered in ash, alone. The psychiatrist asked how she escaped. She only said, the mouth closed, for a while. Then she smiled. And before she died that night, she whispered, "If it opens again, don't speak. That's how it enters you." The doctor resigned 6 months later, burned all his notes. All but one line survived, found decades later in a personal journal. What if the ritual worked? What if the mouth is still listening? The official story was simple. Blackwater Mill burned from within. Wood rot, faulty gas lines, an unfortunate tragedy. Case closed. But in 1978, a series of documents surfaced, sent anonymously to a Vatican archivist. Stamps and signatures matched. The letters were real, and they told a very different story. Blackwater Mill was not an isolated orphanage. It was Facility 4, one of 7, each part of something called the Veritas Sequence, a transnational program designed to locate oracular anomalies in children deemed spiritually directionless, or, as the notes put it, those born outside sacred time, the unaligned, the unspoken for. Blackwater was unique, though, because it didn't just test for anomalies, it created them. Using deprivation, symbolic trauma, synchronized prayer, the goal wasn't salvation. It was disruption, to tear down the psychic boundary between doctrine and something older, what they called the first voice. The children were raised in silence for months, then exposed to controlled scripture, fragmented, out of order, sung backward under duress. It wasn't theology. It was trigger programming. And it worked. In Blackwater Mill, Subject 12 began speaking in dreams, fluent in multiple dead languages. He could hear Mass before it happened, recite sermons from churches he'd never seen. He stopped using his name, started using numbers. The priests believed he had become a conduit, an unbaptized mouth that could receive messages not from God, but from something beneath him. Then came the fire, but not because of a mistake. The final report was clear. Subject 13 has destabilized containment. Vocal resonance exceeds threshold. Physical structure will not hold. Recommend evacuation and transfer of remaining viable protocols. So they did. In 1896, a new facility opened in rural Italy. No paper trail, but satellite photos show a structure built to identical specs. Stone chapel, central dormitory, underground cells, all behind 15-foot walls. And guess what they called it? Domus, House of 13. There were no orphans listed, only one resident according to declassified registry logs. A boy. No date of birth, no parents. Just a note. Eyes milky, mouth sealed with thread, will not eat, but the walls continue to hum. Whatever escaped the fire, they tried to contain it. But some things can't be rebuilt. They remember their blueprints, and if the humming returns, it means the mouth has not forgotten. Her name was Lillian Marcotte. Investigative journalist. Brilliant, stubborn, quietly excommunicated for publishing a series on sacrificial rites in Eastern Europe. But she didn't stop, because she'd found a trail, buried in old Vatican audits and shipping logs. 7 facilities, each disguised as orphanages, cloisters, or failed seminaries, each designed for the same purpose: contact. Lillian started with photographs, blueprints, burial maps. She published nothing, because it wasn't time. Instead, she traveled alone, under aliases, no camera crew, no companions. The first facility she found was in Hungary, closed in 1912 after audio contamination. She spoke with a local who remembered the strange tolling bells, how the birds would fall silent for days. The second, a monastery in France, burned down in 1926. Locals said the stone never cooled, not even decades later. Facility 3 was harder. A convent, deep in the Pyrenees. They never used fire. They used cement, poured over every floor, every doorway. Lillian got inside, brought back fragments of hymnals. They had no words, only phonetics, reverse chants, echo codes. Facility 4 was Blackwater Mill, the one she obsessed over. But she skipped it, said she already knew what was buried there. Instead, she moved to the 5th, a tower outside Warsaw. And then, the 6th, an unnamed ruin in northern Scotland. It was there her trail stops. No photos, no letters, only a notebook mailed anonymously to her sister 2 months later. Torn, water damaged, but legible. It read, "They weren't experimenting on children. They were mapping resonance thresholds, looking for a unified frequency in human suffering." She described a stone chamber. Perfect acoustics. where walls amplified breath until it echoed backward. She heard whispers she hadn't spoken yet. And then, one final entry. The voice doesn't come through the ritual. The ritual is the voice. We're inside it. It doesn't need us to believe. It just needs us to listen. Lillian was never seen again. But the notebook? It was analyzed by a sound technician. She found traces of an inaudible tone embedded in the ink itself. When played back through a frequency translator, the technician collapsed and later repeated something she couldn't explain. 13. It was never a number. It was a chord. The man's name was Elias Broom, an orphan, raised in silence. He wasn't supposed to become a composer, but silence does strange things to a mind. He said music came to him not in melodies, but in shapes, geometries, patterns he saw when he closed his eyes. By 1833, he'd completed only one piece of music. One. It had no title, just a symbol. He wrote it for 13 voices, but not to be sung in harmony. Each line moved against the others, atonal, arrhythmic, like a scream drawn out across different throats. The piece was performed only once, a rehearsal held at dusk. Witnesses described what followed as an unmooring. The singers froze, then began to weep, slowly, in sync. One tore at his throat. Another began counting, backward, not in English, not in Latin, in something no one could recognize. The conductor was the first to collapse. When he came to, he said, "I heard my mother's voice, but she was buried in December, and she was laughing." The performance was halted. The sheet music was confiscated by church officials. Elias Broom was placed under observation. Within days, he stopped speaking, not out of madness, but from reverence. He claimed he hadn't composed the piece. He had translated it, copied it from dreams he'd started having after walking past a chapel ruin near Blackwater Mill. He described voices without mouths, structures built to carry sound, not prayer, and a note that appeared everywhere, in the trees, in the walls, in the stars, a frequency made flesh. Then one night, Broom vanished. His cell locked from the inside. Only a phrase scrawled on the floor in chalk. "You don't sing the song sings you." The sheet music was buried deep in an archive known only to a few. But in 1974, a fragment resurfaced in a private collection, analyzed by digital tools for the first time. It wasn't muses, and it was architecture, a sonic diagram. The 13 voices matched the spatial layout of Blackwater Mill. Every dormitory, every prayer chamber, every pipe in the wall. The orphanage was not a home. It was a living instrument, and the children, they were taught to vibrate. It was never on the blueprints, never mentioned in construction records. But the floor gave way in February 1924. A crack, silent, spreading beneath the altar behind the rear dormitory. And then, one morning, the earth simply fell in, 12 feet down. A perfect circle. Stone walls, seamless, no mortar. The room had no windows, no stairs, no doors. Just a spiral carved into the center, and something buried beneath it. At first, they assumed it was an old cistern, until one of the local priests stepped inside. He immediately went pale, climbed back out without a word, locked the place behind iron, and told the others, nothing sacred should echo like that. Because the sound in that chamber wasn't just acoustic, it was responsive. When someone breathed, the walls inhaled. When someone whispered, the spiral hummed. But it wasn't the sound that unsettled the workers. It was the way silence behaved. Too thick, too heavy, as if it were being held. They lowered down a candle. No wind, no movement. But the flame bent sideways against gravity. By spring, a decision was made. Seal it again, poured concrete, reinforced steel, crosses in every corner. But it didn't hold. The spiral reappeared, days later, not carved, grown, veins of dark stone threading back through the concrete like roots returning to earth. The children weren't told, but some of them began drawing spirals in their sleep. Others began humming melodies that descended, falling notes. No teacher knew where they came from. And then, the girl, Abigail Croft, 8 years old. She vanished for 2 hours during prayer. When they found her, she was down in the chamber. No light, no rope. She simply looked up and said, "It needed a throat." Her voice was wrong after that. Too deep, too steady. And every time she slept, the others said the floor beneath them would vibrate, as if the chamber wasn't a room anymore. It was a receiver. And Abigail? She was just the first one it could tune. He hadn't spoken in 41 years. Not a single word. Not to police, not to doctors, not to the church. The last boy from Blackwater Mill, the only confirmed survivor. His name erased from public records, referred to only as Patient M, institutionalized in 1935, diagnosed with involuntary mutism and psychotic silence. But his pulse was always steady, his sleep undisturbed, as if he weren't hiding trauma, but preserving something. Then, in 1979, during a routine medical procedure, he slipped into sedation and began to speak, clearly, deliberately. The nurse recorded every word. The tape was buried by the diocese, unsealed only after the church's own archives were subpoenaed in 2011. His voice, calm, almost clinical, said this: "We weren't there to become priests. We were there to become vessels." He described a room beneath the mill, not the spiral chamber, another one, round, wooden, with no corners, and a hole in the center of the floor, just wide enough for a child's head. Every night, they were taught a chant, not in Latin, not in English. It had no meaning, just pressure. A pattern of breath. 3 inhalations, 1 exhale, repeated until their bodies vibrated. He said, "We could feel our teeth shifting, our blood bubbling, our names moving outside our skin." They were told this was purification, but he knew better. They weren't being cleansed. They were being retuned. Every day, they had to wear iron around their necks, collars made from melted bells. If a child removed theirs, even for a moment, they reported hearing voices through the walls, calling them by names they hadn't been given yet. One boy, Thomas Hale, stopped wearing his, said he could hear the source. He vanished 3 days later. No trace. Patient M didn't cry when he said it. He smiled and whispered, "He made it home." Then he leaned forward, still under sedation, and asked the nurse, "Do you hear it now? That note beneath the silence?" The nurse paused. In the background of the tape was something. A hum. Steady, low, alive. The audio was examined in 2012. It wasn't a frequency. It was a voice, held just outside human hearing, waiting for a throat. The structure was slated for demolition. Blackwater Mill, abandoned for over 80 years, finally scheduled to be leveled in spring 2011. But before the bulldozers arrived, a team of preservationists petitioned for one final archaeological pass. Just 3 days. Just the foundations. What they found in the stone halted the demolition entirely. At first glance, it looked like erosion. But it wasn't natural. Too precise. Too rhythmic. Stone grooves, spiraled and shallow, set into the underside of the altar's support beams. These weren't symbols. They were phonographs, not for eyes, but for air. When wind passed through the gaps, the room began to whisper, not all at once. First, just a hiss, then a layered tone, then the slow emergence of syllables. One of the researchers, a sound linguist named Carla Rowe, spent weeks trying to isolate the sequence. She discovered something chilling. The grooves weren't carved to hold meaning. They were carved to mimic voices. Recreations of children's speech, looped, reversed, and encoded into the stone itself. It wasn't a chant. It was a recording. Centuries old, in a dialect older than Aramaic, pre-Latin, Proto-Semitic. And when traced with a gloved finger, exactly along the carved line, it spoke back. Rose said she felt air move against her skin, not from the wind, but from within the rock. Then the whisper. One made the call. One still holds the tone. One is yet to open the throat. The stone vibrated, the gloves split, and her skin turned pale, as if drained. She stopped the tracing, burned the gloves, never returned. The tape of that whisper, confiscated by federal officials 4 days later. But a backup survived. Leaked to a private sound lab in Prague. They confirmed the voice was real, not synthesized. And worse, it was anticipatory. The waveform revealed that the whisper began before Carla started to, racing the stone, as if it knew, as if it had been waiting. Not for words, but for recognition, not for summoning, but for permission. And somewhere, on that frequency, something still listens. It remembers the names it was taught, and it only ever needed one thing, a voice to answer back. His name was Enoch, or at least that's what the records call him. He arrived at Blackwater in 1892, age 10, orphaned during a cholera outbreak in western Massachusetts. No birth certificate, no family, no voice. The priests noted that he never cried, never laughed, never whispered. They called it divine silence, a sign of purity. But Sister Alana, one of the original caretakers, wrote something different in her private journal. It isn't that the boy cannot speak, it's that he listens too well. By 1894, Enoch was the last child who still wore the iron collar. He slept beside the altar each night, woke at precisely 3:07 a.m. every morning. When asked what woke him, he would point to the floor, to the space between the wooden planks, to underneath. Then, on the last night Blackwater was operational, he finally spoke. Just 7 words. No one could translate them at the time, but they were written down phonetically by Father Barak. Katur velni, alem oth kalem. The next morning, Enoch was gone. No trace. No body. The room untouched, but his collar, melted, was found on the altar. What happened to him was sealed as a divine disappearance. But in 2009, an archaeologist in Thrace unearthed something older. A circular altar. Pre-Christian, pre-Judaic, covered in glyphs. And at the center, etched in the same pattern as Blackwater's chant chamber, were 7 words. Identical, letter for letter. Katur velni, alam oth kalam. Translated by sound historians. The throat is open. The voice may now return. It wasn't a name. It was an offering. A phrase used in ancient death rites, not to mourn the dead, but to invite them to speak again. A resurrection not of flesh, but of sound. What Enoch triggered wasn't an escape. It was a response. He wasn't running from something. He was becoming its voice. Sister Alana's last journal entry, Scraw, led the morning after his disappearance. There is no silence now. Even in the stillness, something speaks, and I fear it's using my breath. December 2nd, 1949. Wilmington, Delaware. A night watchman patrolling the ruins of St. Elmo's Cathedral spotted movement through the broken nave. He thought it was a squatter. Instead, he found a man dressed in 19th century clerical garments, kneeling before a rotted altar. His hands were clasped, his eyes blank. The cathedral had been shut since 1903. The man didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't flinch when police approached. And when they tried to move him, he began to hum, a low, spiraling chant, like reversed Gregorian melody, barely audible. The doctor said he was in a fugue state. But his body, it was impossible. Clean skin, no decay, no calluses, as if preserved in amber. He was fingerprinted, measured, photographed, but no matches, not in any registry, not in any parish. Until a nun, brought in from Boston to assist, noticed something. A scar, just beneath his left collarbone, shaped like an inverted V. The same mark worn by Father Elric Dannemore, one of the lead experimenters from Blackwater Mill, declared dead in 1901, buried in a sealed grave. They exhumed the coffin. It was full, but not of a body, only stones, charred wood, and one object, a melted iron collar, the same design used for the Orphan boys. The man in Wilmington was kept in observation. He never aged, never moved. Until one night in February 1950, he stood up, tore open his shirt, and revealed 7 glyphs tattooed along his ribcage, identical to the stone grooves found beneath Blackwater's altar. When read aloud by a linguist, the lights in the room burst. The audio recording from that moment, kept in a sealed vault in Boston, reveals a voice that speaks in 2 layers. One human, the other isn't. It bends time, shifts syllables, repeats the word Calum 21 times. After the chant ends, silence falls. But on the tape, something else is heard in the far background, faint but rising, children's laughter, then coughing, then a single knock. Rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone or something on the other side of the veil was answering back. They shut Blackwater Mill down in 1896. The buildings collapsed. The altar was dismantled. The remaining priests were reassigned or disappeared quietly into sanitariums. The church issued no official statement, only a footnote in diocesan records. Order dissolved. No relics remain. But they were wrong. Something remained. Because in 1971, a boy in Ithaca, New York, 8 years old, was admitted to St. Aurelius Hospital for night terrors. He screamed in a language no one recognized. His parents were farmers. No TV, no radio, no outside influence. But when a nurse recorded the episode, a translator brought in from Eastern Europe dropped his notes and turned white. The boy had spoken the same 7 words Enoch whispered before his disappearance. Katurvelni, alam uthkalam. Only now, a new word was added. Beral. The nurse asked what it meant, and the boy replied, not with fear, but with something closer to reverence. The name of the silence, inside the sound. That child was later placed in a private care facility. The tapes of his speech were sent to a Boston archive, then disappeared. The wing where he slept burned down in 1973. No survivors. But here's what they don't tell you. The land Blackwater once stood on. It was sold in 1992 to a private religious firm, one that's changed names 6 times in 30 years. Their emblem? A single iron ring with 7 dots arranged in a spiral. Locals say they still see lights in the trees behind the old foundation, soft chanting, like children singing without mouths. No buildings remain, no structure, no cross, just earth, and something beneath it. In 2023, a hiker walking near the ruins claimed she heard voices below the ground. She held her phone to the dirt, pressed record. And for 10 seconds, static. Then, the faint sound of breathing, followed by a whisper right at the edge of hearing. The throat is open. The voice may now return. That audio has been studied, verified. No splicing, no tricks. It ends with one final sound. Not a word, not a name, just the clinking of metal, tightening around a neck. And then, the quietest sound of all, a child's breath, cut short.